Bueno. Bienvenido.
Welcome. Quiet, please. Welcome to the second roundtable on adapting to the new types of demand. Interpretation, new needs, new training needs. And for this we have two guest speakers. Dr. Martin, former master's director at the University of Granada, Mr. Frank Mohada, who's also a researcher and who's a professor at the University of Vienna, and Klaus Ziegler, who runs the technical commission at AIC, and Stefano Maroni, who will take the floor on behalf of one of AIC's committees. Let me give the floor to Martin first.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to be here with you today, and especially to participate in this panel, which is extremely timely and very interesting. Now, the title of the panel is New Settings, but I'd actually like to place the word new in inverted commas, because I actually don't think that interpreting in these settings is so new. I think that language mediation as such has no doubt been taking place in these settings for many years in one way or another. But I think what's probably changed is that over the last 20 to 25 years, Hello? Yes? Language mediation as such in these settings has started to become recognized as a professional activity. Very slowly, too slowly, but I think that's what's happened. I think actually what is new is the move towards the recognition, or even in some cases the professionalization of this activity, rather than the activity itself. And I think that there may be less structural trends that have contributed here, for example, mass refugee movements, or the fact that we live in an interconnected world, so there's heightened awareness of rights and greater visibility of migrants' presence, perhaps through NGOs and advocacy groups. There are probably more practices on the part of the authorities in some countries geared to acknowledging certain rights, even though those rights may then not actually be implemented. There are also international, legal instruments guaranteeing certain rights, and there's pressure from the academic world because of research findings. In community interpreting, which is what I would like to focus on now, the move towards professionalization began in some countries in the 70s and 80s. Firstly in Australia, then Canada, the UK, Sweden, and the Netherlands. And when I talk about community interpreting, I'm referring to healthcare, education, social services, police, and legal settings. And I'm sure a very good example is the UK, and I'm sure many people will remember the late Pat Longley, who was probably the mother of conference interpreting in the UK, but very definitely the mother of community interpreting, as she mustered support to set up a nationwide system of professional training and accreditation for community interpreters through the National Register of Public Service Interpreters. And similar processes occurred in some of the other countries that I've mentioned. So there would seem to be certain common features present in countries that pioneered professionalization of community interpreting. The presence of minority language groups made up either of migrants or indigenous minorities, or both, as is the case in Australia and in Canada, coupled with the tradition of the welfare state, in which citizens have certain rights which it is the state's responsibility to cover. But we're talking about a very small group of countries. And despite the move to professionalization in these countries, in most other countries, in Spain, for example, where we are, this activity is still today performed by anybody who claims to speak the languages concerned, usually without any need to offer proof of such claims and no quality requirements whatsoever, such as training or accreditation, and extremely low remuneration. Now, obviously, there are numerous reports of totally unacceptable situations in such countries, victims of gender-based violence being interpreted by the perpetrator of that violence, prisoners interpreting each other in jails, children interpreting for their parents in meetings with teachers and other settings, hospital cleaners as healthcare interpreters, to quote a famous article by my colleague Franz Perschacker, members of criminal gangs interpreting each other in court, and these anecdotes are common in many countries. So the consequences of not taking this kind of interpreting seriously are potentially quite dire. And the situations in which this kind of interpreting is required are very difficult situations with power imbalances, with huge cultural gaps, with vulnerability, with dilemmas regarding ethics and role, with the job of managing interaction between conflicting parties, and all of this requires appropriate training and accreditation. Now, we're aware of such situations now because over the last 25 years, there's been a huge boom in research and academic activity related to interpreting in non-conference settings. In fact, research has been quite disproportionate if we compare it to actual professional practice. And there have been some excellent PhD dissertations, also some top-level European research projects with quite substantial budgets, such as the ones on the screen, Grotius, on legal interpreting, Qualitas, on the accreditation of interpreters, and SOSVIX, on interpreting for victims of gender-based violence. So we do have a contradiction here because we have an accumulation of theoretical and practical knowledge and a few countries which offer examples of best practices regarding training and accreditation and how to organize the profession. But in most countries, there is no recognized profession. And this is a vicious circle, of course, because very few candidates, potentially good candidates, are going to be willing to invest time and money in training for a profession that doesn't really exist and doesn't allow them to make a living. There was hope that this situation would change, at least in legal settings, as a result of the EU Directive 64/2010 on the right to interpretation and translation in criminal proceedings. The aim of which is to guarantee quality court interpreting across the European Union. But the transposition of this directive in many countries, certainly here in Spain, has been extremely disappointing, patchy, incomplete, unrealistic, so nothing much has changed. Basically, there doesn't seem to be very much political will to change the situation regarding this kind of interpreting in non-conference settings. The economic crisis served as a pretext for reducing budgets and particularly for outsourcing public services. So, in fact, even in countries that did have professional organization, professional recognition like the UK, the outsourcing trend has sadly put an end to the admirable system that was set up by Pat Longley in the 80s. I believe that the lack of budget availability is actually quite relative. In the case of Spain, 80% of the funds that are allocated by the Ministry of Justice in the public tender for translation and interpreting services in court ends up in the hands of the intermediaries themselves, to whom the service is outsourced. So if this fee was actually given to the interpreters, then it would be fairly acceptable. But here we see, as has already been mentioned here this afternoon, interpreting is being seen as a commodity, as an opportunity for business rather than as a cognitively complex professional service. And I think governments are very careful to ensure that they have top-level interpreters when they meet, but they feign unawareness of the importance of quality when providing interpreting for public services. And I think there's a degree of cynicism here, to say the very least. And also immigrants are perceived as being temporary. And even in countries where community interpreting has been professionalized, more funds are allocated to language teaching than to interpreting services. Another interesting aspect is that in conference interpreting, professional development has been driven by the profession itself, more or less united around AIC, whereas interpreting in non-conference settings is extremely fragmented and is driven, or not driven, as is usually the case, by the public institutions themselves. And also the prestige of different kinds of interpreters would seem to be closely linked to that of their clients. So conference interpreters offer services to the world's elite, whereas in non-conference settings, the opposite occurs. And this lends conference interpreters a reflected prestige that interpreters in other settings do not have. And in fact, quite the opposite, their work is not valued at all. AIC as an association and also individual members of AIC have contributed to the professionalization of interpreting in some of these new settings over the years. If interpreting in these settings does not become consolidated as a recognized profession, I think we will continue to see people's rights unprotected, and we will continue to see the perpetuation of a false idea of the profession as a whole as being an ad hoc activity for people who claim knowledge of languages. And I would appeal for a broad alliance of the profession as a whole to offset both of these undesirable consequences, which I think are undesirable for everybody involved. If AIC, and I would take advantage of being here at this meeting today to say that if AIC can in any way institutionally bring to bear its influence to change this situation, then I think AIC would be doing a great service. Thank you very much.